It was just another quiet night on the outskirts of town, until the blaring sirens and flashing lights cut through the darkness, catching a man in their spotlight, his calm, steady gaze meeting the officers as if he already knew this was going to be more than a routine stop. Hey there, welcome. Quick question. Do you love your grandma's cooking? Or maybe you've got that one pet who acts like they own the house? If that made you smile, you're in the right place. Well, here on an incredible and teachable story, we share tales as heartwarming and unforgettable as those special moments. So, if you love good stories as much as you love your favorite comfort food or that wagging tail waiting at home, hit subscribe and join the family. We've got something here for everyone. It was a night when the city seemed to exhale its weariness. The streets stretched out in empty silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of a distant radio or the dull roar of a passing car. The air hung heavy with the smell of wet asphalt and gasoline, the faint drizzle painting a slick sheen on the pavement under the faint glow of flickering lampposts. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, its echo swallowed quickly by the night. Joe and Marvin rolled slowly through the damp streets in their patrol car, the low hum of the engine blending with their laughter. Joe's gravelly voice cut through the cabin as he recounted another exaggerated tale of their past antics, his words punctuated by Marvin's occasional chuckles. The smell of stale coffee from the cup holder mixed with the faint trace of leather and sweat in the confined space. "The new chief?" Joe snorted, shifting in his seat, the dim glow from the dashboard casting shadows on his smirking face. "All these big ideas about reform. Bet he wouldn't last a day out here in the real world." Marvin, eyes fixed ahead, grinned. "Probably some desk jockey. Can't tell his badge from his boots." Their laughter was suddenly cut short as Joe's hand shot up to grip the steering wheel tighter, his gaze narrowing at a figure up ahead. "What the hell?" he muttered, the humor draining from his voice. The man walked alone, his strides measured and deliberate, his polished shoes clicking softly against the wet pavement. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a dark suit and overcoat, the sharp cut of the fabric almost defying the gritty surroundings. The glow from the lamppost caught his silhouette, casting an imposing shadow that trailed behind him like a silent companion. Joe slowed the car, the tires crunching softly against scattered debris on the street. Marvin squinted, his expression sharpening with suspicion. "What's he doing out here at this hour?" Joe muttered, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. The squad car's lights flicked on, their harsh red and blue beams slicing through the darkness. The siren wailed briefly, its sharp cry piercing the quiet night. The man stopped mid-stride, turning slowly to face the approaching car. His movements were calm, deliberate, almost rehearsed, as if he had been expecting this. Joe and Marvin stepped out of the car, their boots splashing into shallow puddles, sending tiny ripples through the stagnant water. The drizzle intensified, the cold droplets pricking their exposed skin like needles. Joe adjusted his belt, his expression a mix of authority and disdain. Marvin's hand lingered on his holster, his eyes scanning the man from head to toe, searching for a reason, any reason, to justify their unease. The man stood still, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his coat. His face was calm, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Is there a problem, officer?" His voice was firm but polite, the kind of tone that neither provoked nor submitted. Joe smirked, stepping closer. The pungent smell of wet concrete and oil wafted up as his boots scraped against the ground. He glanced at Marvin, who gave a small nod, then turned his attention back to the man. "Yeah, there's a problem," Joe said, his voice laced with mockery. "You shouldn't be out here looking so comfortable." The man raised an eyebrow, his smile fading slightly. There was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet, unspoken challenge. "I wasn't aware walking was a crime," he said evenly. Marvin stepped forward, his stance wide, his hand still resting on his belt. "You got ID on you?" he barked. The man sighed softly, a barely perceptible exhale that misted in the cold night air. He reached into his coat pocket slowly, deliberately, pulling out a leather wallet. The movement was smooth, practiced, yet it didn't seem to satisfy the growing tension in Joe and Marvin's expressions. Joe snatched the wallet, flipping it open with a quick flick of his wrist. His eyes scanned the ID, but the words didn't seem to register. He tossed it back carelessly, the leather smacking against the man's chest before falling into his waiting hand. "Doesn't look right?" Joe said with a smirk. "What doesn't look right?" the man asked, his voice carrying an edge now, subtle but sharp enough to cut through the mounting hostility. "You," Joe said simply, his smirk widening as he motioned to Marvin. Before the man could respond, Marvin grabbed his arm, twisting it roughly behind his back. The sound of the handcuffs snapping into place echoed down the empty street. The man winced slightly, the first crack in his otherwise unshakable composure. The lamppost nearest them flickered, its light casting uneven shadows across the scene. Joe gestured toward it with a grin. "Tie him up there," he said. The man said nothing, but his eyes bore into Joe's, unblinking, unyielding. "You'll regret this," he said softly, his voice calm, almost prophetic. Joe laughed, the sound harsh and hollow against the night. "Yeah? We'll see about that." And as Marvin tied the man to the cold, wet metal of the lamppost, the drizzle turned into a steady rain, washing over the scene like a silent witness to an act that would change everything. The rain fell harder now, its cold droplets hammering the empty street and bouncing off the squad car's hood with a rhythm that seemed almost accusatory. The distant hum of a generator added a low, mechanical growl to the night, but even that sound seemed to fade under the sharp clicks of Joe's boots as he paced. His expression twisted with a cruel mix of amusement and disdain. Peter stood firm despite the chill soaking into his coat, his breath visible in the frigid air. The handcuffs dug into his wrists, their metal biting sharply against his skin every time he shifted slightly to regain balance on the uneven pavement. His expression was a masterclass in restraint. The furrow of his brow revealed irritation, but his jaw remained set, his lips pressed tightly together in a silent refusal to let anger slip through. Joe leaned against the lamppost now, his arms crossed, while Marvin finished securing Peter to the cold metal with a thick, frayed rope. The fibers scratched noisily against the damp pole as Marvin pulled it tight, the rough texture grating against Peter's wrists. The lamppost flickered again, casting intermittent shadows across Peter's face, illuminating his unwavering stare one moment and obscuring it in darkness the next. From a nearby building, a curtain shifted briefly, and the faint outline of a face appeared at a cracked window. The unseen bystander watched for a moment, their breath fogging the glass, but quickly withdrew, the curtain falling back into place. Even the silent witness seemed afraid to intervene. "Loitering, huh?" Joe said, his voice cutting through the steady patter of rain. He smirked as he circled Peter, his boots splashing through shallow puddles that reflected the lampost's fractured light. "You know, Marvin, I can't stand people who just linger, taking up space where they don't belong." Marvin chuckled, a hollow sound as he adjusted his grip on the rope. "Yeah, they think they're above the rules." He leaned in closer to Peter, his breath a mix of stale coffee and tobacco. "Bet you think you're special, don't you?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt. Peter exhaled slowly, his breath steady even as the rain plastered his hair to his forehead and rolled in thin streams down his face. His eyes shifted from Marvin to Joe, meeting the latter's mocking gaze with a quiet strength that made Joe's smirk falter for a fraction of a second. "I gave you my ID," Peter said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "You know exactly who I am." Joe snorted, feigning indifference as he gestured dismissively. Yeah, you're the mayor, the president, maybe even the pope for all I care. Out here, you're just another guy who needs to learn some respect." The rain intensified, its steady rhythm turning into a chorus of drumming as it struck the lamppost, the car, and the surrounding asphalt. Water pooled at Peter's feet, soaking into the cuffs of his trousers and dulling the once gleaming shine of his shoes. The air grew colder, the smell of wet metal mingling with the faint, acrid tang of exhaust fumes from a nearby street. Peter shifted slightly, testing the give of the rope against his shoulders. The coarse fibers pressed into his skin through his damp coat, each movement sending tiny prickles of discomfort up his arms. He lifted his gaze to Joe again, his voice measured but firm. "You're making a mistake." Joe stepped closer, so close that Peter could see the raindrops clinging to the brim of his hat. "A mistake?" Joe echoed, his tone mocking. "No, buddy. The mistake was you thinking you could walk around here like you own the place." Marvin chuckled, his fingers drumming against the butt of his flashlight as he leaned casually against the squad car. "Teach him a lesson, Joe," he said, the words rolling off his tongue like a dare. Joe grabbed Peter's coat collar, jerking him forward slightly, though the ropes held firm. The lamppost groaned faintly under the tension. Peter didn't flinch, his gaze locked on Joe's with an intensity that made the officer pause. "You'll regret this," Peter said softly, his voice low but resonant, each word cutting through the rain like a blade. Joe's smirk returned, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes now, quickly masked by a scoff. "Yeah? Is that so?" Marvin, sensing the subtle shift in Joe's demeanor, stepped forward to add his weight to the scene. "You're awfully confident for a guy tied to a pole," he said, his laugh forced, the sound almost drowned out by the downpour. Peter didn't reply. He simply leaned his head back against the cold, wet metal of the lamppost, his eyes never leaving Joe's. For the first time that night, a hint of a smile played on his lips, not one of amusement or mockery, but of quiet assurance. It wasn't a smile of defeat, but of a man who knew the storm brewing around him was temporary. The rain fell harder still, the droplets now feeling like icy needles on exposed skin. Joe and Marvin exchanged glances, their bravado momentarily cracking under the weight of the man's unrelenting composure. The streetlight above them buzzed faintly, its flickering glow casting erratic shadows that danced like ghosts on the wet pavement. Somewhere deep in the night, the faint wail of another siren rose, distant but growing steadily louder. Joe's jaw tightened, and Marvin shifted uncomfortably. Peter's smile grew almost imperceptibly wider as he spoke again, his voice carrying through the rain like a promise. "It's not me you should be worried about." The station buzzed with life as the early shift began. Officers moved through the halls with an air of anticipation, boots echoing sharply against the tile floors. The aroma of fresh coffee wafted through the air, mingling with the familiar, musty scent of old paperwork stacked in the corners. Phones rang intermittently, their sharp tones adding to the controlled chaos. In the chief's office, a gleaming nameplate sat prominently on the desk. Chief Peter Calloway. The polished brass reflected the overhead fluorescent lights, a stark reminder of the station's new leadership. Nearby, a fresh stack of policy documents sat untouched, their crisp edges a testament to the change about to unfold. Meanwhile, Joe and Marvin strolled into the station, drenched from the rain but grinning like schoolboys sharing a secret. Their laughter bounced off the walls, crude and self-satisfied. Marvin tossed his soaked hat onto a nearby bench, droplets splattering onto the floor. "Did you see his face?" Joe guffawed, his voice carrying through the corridor. "Mr. Big Shot thought he could mouth off to us. Tied up nice and tight now." Marvin chuckled, shaking water from his jacket. "Bet he'll think twice before walking these streets again." In the corner, a young officer named Ella paused mid-sip of her coffee. Her sharp hearing had caught the tail end of their conversation. She frowned, her stomach twisting with unease. Ella was new to the force, but her instincts were sharp. Something about the way Joe and Marvin spoke didn't sit right. She quietly moved closer, pretending to review the duty roster pinned on the wall nearby. As Joe continued his boastful recounting, Ella's heart began to race. Words like lamppost and rain painted a picture she couldn't ignore. Her eyes flicked nervously to the station's roster, scanning until her gaze landed on the name, Chief Peter Calloway. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The coffee in her hand suddenly tasted bitter, and she set it down, her fingers trembling slightly. Was it possible? Could the man Joe and Marvin were bragging about be their new chief? Ella's mind swirled with conflicting thoughts. If she was wrong, this could destroy her credibility. But if she was right, she swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and headed straight for Captain Wright's office. Captain Wright was an imposing figure, his salt and pepper hair lending him an air of authority earned over decades of service. He was sipping his coffee when Ella entered, her face pale and voice hesitant. "Sir, I think—" "No, I know. There's been a mistake," she began, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Joe and Marvin, they detained someone. I think it's the new chief." Wright froze mid-sip, his brow furrowing deeply. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice low but dangerously controlled. Ella repeated herself, her hands gripping the back of the chair in front of his desk. The captain's face turned ashen. His hand shook slightly, spilling coffee onto his desk. The dark liquid spread quickly, pooling around scattered papers. His jaw clenched as he let out a sharp breath. "You tied up who?" he bellowed, his voice booming through the station like a thunderclap. Moments later, the station erupted into a flurry of activity. Wright stormed through the halls, barking orders as Ella and a small team hurried after him. Flashing lights illuminated the station parking lot as officers piled into patrol cars, the engines roaring to life. Ella climbed into the back seat of Wright's vehicle, her nerves frayed as the car sped down the rain-slicked streets. The tires screeched with every sharp turn, the wet asphalt spraying water against the sides of the car. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension, the faint smell of leather seats mixed with the lingering scent of Wright's spilled coffee. No one spoke. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic thud of windshield wipers and the distant wail of another squad car's siren. Ella's hands were clenched tightly in her lap, her palms damp with sweat. Wright's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his jaw set in a grim line. They arrived at the scene in a blaze of flashing red and blue lights. The rain had eased to a drizzle, but the air was still heavy with moisture. The sound of their arrival shattered the eerie quiet of the empty street. Peter was still tied to the lamppost, his coat soaked through, water dripping from his hair onto the shoulders of his suit. Despite his disheveled appearance, he stood tall, his composure unbroken. His eyes, sharp and penetrating, were fixed on Joe and Marvin, who stood a few paces away, their faces pale and slack with dawning realization. Wright stepped out of the car, slamming the door hard enough to make Marvin flinch. His boots splashed through a shallow puddle as he approached, his voice like a whip crack in the rain-soaked night. "What in God's name have you done?" Joe stammered, his earlier bravado crumbling. "Cap, we didn't know?" "You didn't know?" Wright's voice rose, the veins in his neck standing out as his fury spilled over. "Did you even bother to check his ID? To ask his name? Or were you too busy playing judge, jury, and executioner?" Marvin opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He cast a desperate glance at Joe, who looked equally stricken. Peter's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Untie me!" Wright turned to him, his expression softening as he hurried to comply. The rope fell away, and Peter rubbed his wrists, his movements deliberate. He stepped forward, his gaze locked on Joe and Marvin, who shrank back as though the very air around him carried a weight they couldn't bear. "You'll answer for this," Peter said, his voice calm but laced with authority. "Both of you." The rain had slowed to a mist, casting a silvery sheen on the pavement as the patrol cars idled, their engines humming softly. Peter stood tall, his drenched suit clinging to his frame, each movement deliberate and measured. Despite the chill of the night air, he radiated an unshakable warmth, a quiet yet commanding force that silenced the whispers around him. "Take me to the station," he said, his voice low and unwavering. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Captain Wright nodded sharply, gesturing for him to enter his vehicle. As Peter stepped into the car, the distinct smell of damp leather greeted him. Water dripped from his sleeves onto the seat, forming small, irregular pools. The atmosphere inside the car was taut, charged with unspoken tension. Ella sat in the back, her hands tightly clasped, her breath uneven as she tried to process the gravity of what had unfolded. Joe and Marvin followed in their squad car, their faces pale and drawn. The once brash laughter that had echoed through the station halls was now a distant memory, replaced by a suffocating silence. Marvin gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white, while Joe stared blankly out the window, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The station, now brightly lit, was abuzz with whispers. News of the incident had spread like wildfire. Officers stood in small clusters, their low murmurs barely audible over the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional ring of a desk phone. The smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered, its once comforting aroma now masking a palpable sense of unease. The main doors opened with a metallic creak, and all heads turned. Peter walked in, water pooling at his feet as he crossed the threshold. Each step echoed loudly in the suddenly hushed room. His presence was magnetic, commanding respect without demanding it. He paused in the center of the squad room, his sharp gaze sweeping across the assembled officers. Their faces betrayed a range of emotions, guilt, curiosity, and for a few, defiance. The shuffling of boots and the rustle of papers punctuated the silence, as though no one dared to speak first. Gather everyone, Peter instructed, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Wright moved swiftly, barking orders to assemble the team. Within minutes, the room was full, officers standing shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on Peter. Peter stood tall, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. Water dripped from his sleeves onto the tiled floor, each droplet echoing in the silence. He began to speak, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable edge of authority. "I joined this force to serve, not to dominate," he said, his eyes locking onto the crowd. "To protect the vulnerable, not to exploit their vulnerability. Tonight, two of our own made a choice that reflects on all of us." The room grew impossibly still. The faint hum of a computer in the corner was the only sound, its monotony contrasting sharply with the charged atmosphere. A few officers shifted uncomfortably, their boots scuffing the floor. Peter continued, his tone unwavering. "Justice is not a weapon. It is not a privilege. It is a responsibility. And when we, the very people entrusted to uphold it, fail, the consequences reverberate far beyond these walls." His words hung heavy in the air, their weight pressing down on every officer in the room. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting fleeting shadows across the walls. Peter turned slowly, his gaze falling on Joe and Marvin. The two officers stood near the back, their faces ashen. Joe's lips parted as though he wanted to speak, but no sound came out. Beads of sweat formed on his brow despite the cool air. Marvin's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, bent, his jaw tight, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. "Officers Joe Peterson and Marvin Tate," Peter said, his voice sharp and clear, "your actions tonight were not just a violation of protocol. They were a betrayal of trust. Trust that this community places in us, and that we must hold sacred." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, quickly silenced by a single raised hand from Captain Wright. "Effective immediately, you are both suspended, pending a full internal investigation." The words hit like a physical blow. Joe's knees buckled slightly, and he reached out to steady himself against a desk. Marvin's face twisted in anger, but he remained silent, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape. "Pack up your belongings," Peter continued. "You will not return until this investigation is concluded, and justice, true justice, has been served." The room was thick with tension. The faint scent of aftershave mixed with the stale air, creating an almost suffocating atmosphere. Officers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of relief, discomfort, and respect. Joe opened his mouth again, his voice hoarse. "Chief, we didn't." "Enough." Peter's voice cut through the room like a whip. "This isn't the time for excuses. This is the time for accountability." Peter took a step back, letting the weight of his words sink in. His soaked shoes squeaked faintly against the tile, a small but jarring sound in the heavy silence. He looked around the room once more, his gaze lingering on each face. "I believe in this force," he said finally, his tone softening slightly. "I believe we can do better, but belief alone isn't enough. Change begins here, with each of us." He turned and walked toward his office, his steps measured and deliberate. As the door closed behind him with a quiet click, the squad room erupted into quiet murmurs. Joe and Marvin remained rooted in place, their faces pale and drawn, while Ella stood nearby, her expression one of quiet triumph mixed with lingering anxiety. The station smelled faintly of rain and tension, a potent reminder of the night's events. But beneath it all, there was a growing sense of hope, a belief that perhaps things could change.